All right. So, welcome to my session, Unlocking Autistic Superpowers in the Workplace. If you think you're in the wrong spot, no, you are not. So, hi, who am I? And no, we're not going through an existential crisis, not right now anyway. I've been told that the standard is to introduce my professional credentials first, but since this presentation isn't about what I do to keep my animals housed and fed, we're going to start with fun facts. I have lived in more countries than US states. I am very wiggly. I run, I do acro, I do strength training, and I collect degrees like other people collect coins. I have a master's in data science, I have a bachelor's in accounting, and I have a bachelor's and a master's in history. Ultimately, it's all data, but if you ever want to talk about early modern Swedish warfare, hi, I am your gal. On the professional side of things, because I have been told I cannot, in fact, be a professional student, I work as a consultant for EJ Enterprises slash Amber Aardvark, a company that James Bartlett, my husband, and I created to do very broadly data stuff from education to coding. So if my professional credentials aren't the primary means of authority here, why am I here? What wasn't in my bio is that I'm autistic. I could say I have autism spectrum disorder, ASD, but that makes it sound like it's something that I carry around with me and can set down when it gets too heavy. And that's not accurate. I can't set it down. I can't pack it up. I can't put it away for a while or ignore it. It's not like a phone or hair that you can change every so often or clothes that you can just strip off and find something more comfortable. It's part of me, it's how I function. So if you want my brain, you get all of my brain, autism and all. And to me, I think that's actually a pretty amazing thing if you have at least a basic understanding of how to interact with it. As a note, me saying I am autistic is how I prefer to talk about myself. Other people might prefer or grammatically require different phrasing. For example, some people with ASD might prefer I have ASD rather than I am autistic. And people with ADHD don't have an adjective to describe themselves other than maybe neurospicy, which is pretty broad and includes ASD and other forms of neurodivergence. And this talk is the result of a myriad of experiences that I've had, many of them negative, particularly in the workplace. And I know that I am far from alone. So I think that it's the best practice to set some expectations and just kind of manage those from the get-go. Here are the questions that we'll cover. We'll cover what this is and isn't, what I hope to accomplish, or put another way, what I hope you'll take away, and some acronyms and some definitions that you'll need to know. So while this topic stems from a deeply personal space for me, this actually isn't about me. It is a non-exhaustive education on how to get the best parts of individuals with ASD in the workplace and beyond, or at least to give a starting point. It is not representative of every autistic person's experience or requirement. We're not a monolith, and as we'll see, there can be competing requirements as well. This is absolutely presented from an autistic perspective, but many of the things that I'll talk about as far as the accommodations can be applied to other forms of neurodivergence. And this is not a comparison or a competition between how different brains are wired. So ASD comes with stereotypes. When you think of an autistic person, what do you imagine? How do they look, speak, or act? What are their interests? And how do you feel about interacting with a person with ASD? So here are a few of the common stereotypes and myths, and most of them are kind of wrong. For example, this is not actually a condition that only affects boys, nor is it a childhood condition that one grows out of. You hear a lot of people talk about curing autism. It is not curable. It's wiring and it doesn't need to be cured. It doesn't signify that a person is broken. It does need to be understood, though. Being autistic does not equate to a lack of empathy. You're thinking about psychopaths. There is no look for autism, and you would be surprised how many people think that there is. Autism doesn't necessarily mean that a person has a learning disability, nor does it indicate that they're a savant like Rain Man. It doesn't actually mean that a person is antisocial or violent. However, speaking of violent, everyone is a little autistic is one that makes me feel so. Um, yes, autism is a spectrum. No, it is not linear. And we'll get into this one in a little bit. Bad dressers, soft clothes, and unprofessional, not really true. So while myths and stereotypes often start with a small grain of truth, let's just stick with the facts. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about, I started thinking about those stereotypes because that's kind of how people talk about what ASD is or what an ASD person is. And as we've seen, it can include stereotypes like being a bad dresser or dressing in weird things like animal onesies. So originally, I called this talk Some Superheroes Wear Animal Onesies, which is also where this funny giraffe pattern that I have comes from. Autism on a whole is perceived as an overall deficit, and the stereotypes surrounding autism often lead to infantilization. The sensory issues that are sometimes tied to clothing, and thus some people enjoy the feel of soft things like blankets or animal onesies, don't really help with that. But I would argue that everyone has their comfort or habit. So why is having a beer after work considered a more acceptable way to deal with the day's stress than being wrapped in something soft for a while? Ironically, there's another conflicting view of autism that many neurotypical people hold, which is that autism is a superpower. Superpowers are associated with superheroes, and I'm pretty sure none of them are infantilized, but maybe I'm missing something. As far as superpowers go, personally, I'd much rather be able to teleport than my current superpowers, like being able to hear electricity or being able to smell what someone like 6 cubicles away from me had for lunch and know what shampoo they use, but maybe that's just me. I also personally lean into the superpower thought, not in a toxic positivity sense, but more from a positive mindset. Our brains are wired differently, so we often see things differently and can help make connections that others might miss. And I think that's pretty cool. I might not be a comic book superhero, but I do have some pretty neat skills. I also don't wear a cape, and that's okay because not all superheroes wear capes either. Think about parents, inventors, and so on. They're doing some pretty amazing things, and the fact that it's not on the world saving end of things is not really that big of a deal. A lot of regular people doing small things is what ultimately changes a life or a business or a community. And supersuits, the ability to fly or being a demigod isn't a requirement to be a superhero in the real world. So while some ordinary superheroes might be unshowered and wearing the same sweatpants 3 days in a row because they're a parent just trying to keep their brand new kid alive, and others might be put together in a business suit, others might be like me and get easily overwhelmed and feel weird as a result. So they put on an animal onesie because it's soft and comforting. And frankly, if you suddenly find that you are a giraffe or a penguin or whatever, it's probably okay to feel a little bit weird. Anyone would feel weird if they found themselves turned into an animal, and life goes on. And yes, this photo is me many years ago when I was working as a banker, which was a terrible fit for a job for me. And I was coming home every day feeling completely burnt out and unable to people. So I was a person pretending to be a banker who was pretending to be a penguin, who was pretending to be a giraffe, who was pretending to be a different banker, which is what that name tag is. It's somebody else's name tag. But that made me feel better, and we listen and we don't judge. More than anything, I want to help you understand ASD a little bit better and break down and reframe stereotypes that create barriers to employment and positive relationships. Or put another way, I hope that you'll be able to embrace autistic superpowers. As a note, while this will be primarily workplace focused, I hope that the things that you learn here will allow you to apply that beyond the workplace as well. So here are some acronyms and some terms that you'll see and should be familiar with. ASD, we've already seen a few times. That is autism spectrum disorder, also just called autism. ND refers to someone who is neurodivergent, or a person who processes information in a way that is considered unusual or different from the norm. Some examples include people who are autistic, ASD, or who have dyslexia. NT or NN refers to neurotypical or neuronormative, which is a person who processes information in a typical way. And now that that's out of the way, let's kind of get into what ASD is. So you'll see that this slide's title includes part 1, but I'm not actually going to go in depth on the diagnostic criteria for ASD. If you want to spend more time reading these, you can ask me for the slides, but also Google exists. You can search autism spectrum disorder DSM-5, and you'll be able to find all of this. The short and sweet summary of the diagnostic criteria is that ASD is characterized by differences in social communication and behavior, and that there's some form of repetitive behavior, interest, or activities, that these were present early on in development and cannot be explained by an intellectual disability, and that they cause impairment. I really don't like that last bit about impairment, and here's why. Impairment, by definition, indicates a state of being diminished, weakened, or damaged, especially mentally or physically, but that's not really the case here. So in the clinical diagnostic criteria, there's a certain degree of ableism built in. People with ASD are optimized differently, and because the workplace is designed for the neurotypical employee, employees with ASD have a hard time thriving. It's like taking a marathoner and throwing them into the 100-meter hurdles and expecting them to perform well, when really all that's necessary is to recognize what they're good at and assign them to that task. So, what are autistic superpowers? Here they are. Logical thinking, good memory, ability to learn information quickly, dependable with routine, adherence to rules, creative problem solving, also sometimes called lateral thinking, honesty, pattern recognition, focus, and the ability to understand a situation or asking why. Now, I don't know about you, but I look at this list and think, gee, this looks like something that every single employer and potential employer I have ever had has told me that they wanted. Now, obviously, not every person with ASD will have every single one of these. As I've mentioned earlier, we're not a monolith. However, if you have a coworker, a candidate, or a new hire who discloses they have ASD, just know that they may come preloaded with a superpower bundle. Here's the important part, though. Just because a person possesses these qualities does not mean you will notice a single one of these in the workplace. And this is in part due to how these are often perceived. And this is made more complicated when appropriate accommodations are not in place to allow these superpowers to come out and play and be recognized as the assets that they are. And at this point, you're probably sitting there going, but my mom, my sister, whoever is neurotypical, and they have some of those traits. And yes, absolutely. These are not limited to people with ASD or other forms of neurodivergence. These things are more likely to be noticed more strongly in people with autism, perhaps, than in a neurotypical person. Like, yes, your sister might be a stickler with time, and she might get irritated if something happens that makes her late. She's probably not going to have a complete meltdown. Here's an example. I like to be on time. I like to be on time so much that when my husband, who I love more than I love cake, was going to make us 5 minutes late to my grandmother's funeral, I had such an epic meltdown that we ended up not going at all. And it not only ruined the entire rest of that day, but the next 3 days as well. And that wasn't even my favorite grandparent. And that's the kind of reaction that your neurotypical mom or sister who likes to be on time probably doesn't have. And just continuing with the time example, know that people's wiring does dramatically influence their perception of time. While a neurotypical has the normative perception, I am painfully aware of every passing second of every single day, and my husband, who is differently neurodivergent than I am, will easily lose 6 to 10 hours without even realizing that it's happening. So, what causes these differences? The short answer is wiring. fMRI images have shown differences essentially in how our brains are put together, where some areas are have more activity and some have less than neurotypical. So there's a definite difference between the neurotypical brain and the autistic brain. But no two brains are alike, even when comparing autistic brain to autistic brain or neurotypical to neurotypical. And those differences in activation kind of create a lumpy profiling. So what is that? Think back to when you were in school. You had some subjects that you really enjoyed and some that you didn't. But regardless, maybe you were able to sit down and study and you got pretty similar grades across the board. And that's the neurotypical expectation, that you'll perform relatively evenly with about the same effort in each subject. Some people, though, are really bad at English and really good at math, or really bad at biology, but exceptional at learning a new language. So their grades might be very different across subjects, despite studying and tutors and going to office hours. And that's kind of how an autistic brain works. It just has a lumpier skill profile. So we've looked at some superpowers and we said that there's a decent chance you would never notice them in the workplace. Why? Well, here's how they're often perceived. Logic is misconstrued as a person being pedantic, argumentative, or cold. A good memory is praised until there's some form of conflict, when a person with ASD is likely to be accused of keeping score. Learning information quickly is often perceived as a threat by coworkers and managers. A preference for routine and rules is perceived as being rigid. Creative problem solving is often seen as problematic as it rocks the boat. And that's not the way we've always done it, is a really common response here. Honesty is seen as rude. Notice a pattern, now you're annoying. If you're focusing deeply on your work to the exclusion of all else, now you're aloof, rigid, and rude. And under no circumstance should one ask questions about a process or rule. Now, you're not only being argumentative, but you're intentionally, personally insulting the person who made that process or rule. Every superhero has their own version of kryptonite. For many people with autism, this falls into two primary categories: sensory and communication. We'll look at sensory first. First, some ASD concepts. Some person might be sensory avoidant, meaning they're more likely to be overwhelmed by sensory information like sound, smell, texture, whereas other people might be the opposite. They might be sensory seeking, meaning their sensory systems are underactive, and so they might want more intense sound, smell, texture, etc. Or it could be both. It could be situationally dependent, or it could depend on that thing. Like maybe you like more intense sounds but less intense smells, or vice versa. It could mean that you want more or less movement, which gets into things like proprioception, which is a person's sense of movement and position. Some people might seek out more movement, or they might want to be very still. And sensory processing issues can also affect a person's interoception, which refers to your body's internal cues that tell you when you're hungry, thirsty, or need to use the restroom. So when a person with ASD does notice they have a need, it's often something that becomes very urgent because the earlier signs were below their ability to actually detect. So in the workplace, think about your office environment. It's typically in person or hybrid. There are different sounds than at home. There are different smells than at home. The lights are different. The air is different because the temperature isn't one you get to choose. Maybe it's drier, maybe it's more humid. I don't know. But that's a lot of differences from your norm, which is a lot from a sensory perspective. You have rigid expectations regarding hours and regarding what productivity and participation look like. When you're in an environment that's over or under stimulating, it's hard to be productive. It's also hard to participate in meetings when you can, for example, smell what people ate for lunch, or people's cologne or perfume is overwhelming. The lights are too bright, the temperature is too cold. Most of your brain power is consumed with not trying to run out of the room crying, and that leaves very little brain power left, if any, for paying attention, let alone participating. On the communication side of things, personally, one of the many reasons people have told me that I can't be autistic is that I can speak. Again, ASD is not a monolith. Some people can speak, some can't at all, some are somewhere in the middle. Others might be usually verbal and quote unquote normal, but go nonverbal when overstimulated. And when an autistic person is verbal, their typical preference is for unambiguous communication, which, as we've seen, is often perceived as being rude. The thing that gets many people with ASD in trouble in the workplace is our different understanding of social situations. For example, I do not understand the unspoken rules of socialization. I cannot read body language unless I know a person very, very well. I have a hard time understanding office politics because for me, doing what's right always comes before everything else, including playing what I perceive to be a very poorly written social game, mainly because it's not written. And read the room is about the most unhelpful piece of advice you can give me because try as I might, I cannot. If this were an in-person conference, I'd have no idea if you all are bored out of your mind, interested, if you're being polite, rude, no idea. And you need to understand why. It's a necessary question. In the workplace, different communication methods can assist with the verbal, nonverbal spectrum, which is great. It's what we have emails and chats for. But now think about how many communication channels you have. I had one job where we had email, Teams with way too many groups and subgroups, Azure DevOps, a ticketing system, and a project management software with a chat feature. Plus, it was culturally normal for one person to ambush another at their desk with verbal requests. A conversation that started in one place would inevitably make its way to every single communication channel and end up having different, often conflicting threads. Undisciplined, disorganized communication seems to be the rule rather than the exception in most offices. There's also a struggle with verbal versus written instructions. Some people do better with one than the other. Personally, I think that even if verbal instructions are given and it's the preferred method, they should always be followed up by written instructions, if for no other reason for paper trail purposes and future clarity. That said, people seem to dislike paper trails. And I'm not sure about everyone's experience here, but every place that I have ever worked at, which has included some highly regulated industries, has lacked accurate documentation. And if the procedures were up to date, they were often completely ignored by some people. And I say some people because only some people would get in trouble for following or for not following the procedures, while others wouldn't. And we're talking about the workplace, so office politics is something you can't avoid, and it's often extremely difficult for an autistic person to understand. It does get easier with more familiarity, but it takes a while to get to that point, and autistic people aren't always kept around long enough to detangle that. And again, back to that needing to ask why. Questions are often discouraged. Um, Even though understanding why something is can help increase understanding of a situation, it can give purpose to a task and help with problem solving. Neurotypicals seem to prefer the status quo, even when they acknowledge things could be better. So who's the rigid one who doesn't like change now? We've looked at the typical workplace and we can see that it is not designed for an autistic person, but accommodations exist, so everything is fine, right? No. More often than not, in the US anyway, companies will follow the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law. In other words, they make accommodations in the sense that they can check a box saying, "We did the thing, so you can't sue us, aren't we great?" rather than providing accommodations in a way that addresses issues of equity, which is the entire point of accommodations. They might say things like, "We bought you noise canceling headphones," or, "But we allowed you to start or end your day 30 minutes, whichever way," or, "We got you a planner." Despite these accommodations, autistic people still tend to not thrive in the workplace. Why? The current workplace trend of seeing accommodations as checkbox items to combat so-called impairments of the autistic employee places fault squarely on the person with ASD, rather than being focused on collective dysfunction, which tends to then amplify existing difficulties in communication, productivity, and participation. When it comes to communication, only the person with ASD is expected to modify what they're doing. Neurotypical expectations of productivity and participation still exist. So with productivity, you're still expected to do your work with a pretty even work tempo, even though that's not really what's typical for ASD, which for that is really it's more common to work in spurts or in some cases asynchronously. And participation, you're expected to externally process or think out loud and have a sort of stream of consciousness of ideas rather than thinking first and speaking later. And it's terribly common to be shamed for asking for accommodations, for holding managers accountable for what they agreed to, and for being a pain because of all of this. Have you ever walked into a door and pushed it and have it not open because it's a pull door and then you complained that the door was broken and you walked away? Probably not, but that's often how people with ASD are treated. They get turned down for jobs or let go because they aren't performing as expected. So, what if you just pulled? I love this post from Lizzie Summerfield. It gets to the crux of how accommodations are versus what they should be. It's always direct communicator. Here's how to soften your communication, and not fluffy communicator. Learn how to make your language less susceptible to misinterpretation and more accessible to other neurotypes. Accommodations are not meant to be one-sided, a single point in time, or a single act. They are meant to be an ongoing commitment that requires consistent, open, and non-judgmental dialogue. The fact that the dialogue, when there is any, is almost universally judgmental or skewed, like what's shown here, is something that often contributes to workplace trauma for autistic employees. And this trauma can make it difficult for someone who needs help to seek it or talk about it when something isn't working for them. Neurodivergent people in general need allies in the workplace, which means educating yourself on enough broad topics that you can open a productive conversation if needed. And we've gone over a few of those things you should already be aware of as they pertain to people with ASD. We've talked about how the sensory environment at a normal workplace can be overwhelming. We've talked about 3 primary problem areas in the workplace that people tend to get in trouble for: communication, productivity, participation. And we've talked about the shame that often goes along with letter of the law accommodations and the accompanying lack of equity. So here are a few ideas for accommodations that you should keep in mind. Communication is a two-way street. Have an open mind about what productivity and participation can look like. If you control the sensory environment, that can help enhance performance with participation, productivity, and communication. Accommodations do not mean a person is less able or less productive. And do not shame your employees and coworkers for having or needing accommodations. There's another thing we need to remember here, which is that accommodations is a pretty fuzzy concept. So there's no such thing as perfect, but we can and should work to stay within that kind of fuzzy zone. To do that, there needs to be a basic understanding and acknowledgement of what the neurotypical expectation is and the ASD reality. I'll present a few examples here, but remember that if you are neurotypical or if you're in a leadership position, it is up to you to create an environment where it is safe for an autistic person to be able to describe their experiences so that you can find and implement appropriate accommodations together. We'll start with the sensory expectations and reality. Remember when we talked about the typical work environment and how there are different sounds and smells and all that than what you have at home? The neurotypical person can readily adapt to a wide array of sensory conditions, typically without even thinking about it, if they even notice it at all. It's kind of well, if you notice something, just focus on the work and it'll be fine. You'll stop realizing that something is different. The ASD reality doesn't really go well with that. Lights, sounds, smells, textures can be detrimentally overwhelming. So ignore it, just doesn't work. So think about this. Have you ever walked into a room that had a really strong smell and maybe after 10 or 15 minutes you stopped noticing it? That's called sensory adaptation, and it's a well-known phenomenon in human biology. Well, most humans anyway. Personally, I've never had the stop noticing it portion of that experience. So maybe that's not the best example. So this one is maybe better. Have you ever had your eyes dilated? If your eyes are dilated, they can't adjust well to light. So a normal room might feel painfully bright, and the only way to get some relief is to wear the funny temporary sunglasses that the eye doctor gave you. That inability to adjust to sensory stimuli is a constant for autistic people. Autistic accommodations are like those sunglasses for your dilated eyes. So how can we determine appropriate accommodations as they pertain to the sensory environment? For the autistic person, it starts with recognizing when self-regulation is necessary in order to avoid a shutdown, which can include going flat or non-responsive, becoming temporarily nonverbal, experiencing panic attacks, and a range of other reactions that are unique to each person. Self-regulation might mean doing something small, like putting on a mask to help dampen smells or using noise-canceling headphones, but sometimes it can mean something bigger, like moving to a more sensory-friendly area. The autistic person also needs to understand that they might need to explain their behavior, not because it's wrong, but because self-regulation can be seen as abrupt or rude to someone who doesn't understand what's happening internally. And this, in and of itself, is an extremely scary thing to do, especially if a person has experienced workplace trauma. So an autistic person might need help navigating those talks. The main idea I'd like for neurotypicals to take away here is to know that there is a huge difference between a bad attitude and self-regulation. Open a conversation and seek to understand rather than judge. And a combination of understanding what autistic adaptation looks like and making an effort to provide necessary accommodations often resolves this so-called bad attitude problem by adjusting perception, helping the autistic person find less disruptive forms of self-regulation, or both. And both sides need to maintain open communication with what is and isn't working, and to understand that sensitivity to stimuli can vary from day to day. When it comes to communication, the neurotypical expectation is to be fairly indirect and expect others to read between the lines. Groupthink is maybe a little more common, and constructive criticism is largely discouraged, even when they say they want it. And it's easy for them to use whichever communication happens to be available and convenient in the moment. The ASD reality is that direct communication is the norm, with more of an I say what I mean and mean what I say mentality. We might be more likely to challenge assumptions and ideas, not because we're trying to be problematic, but because we probably have a question about it or see something that maybe looks like it was missed. And might be thrown off by inconsistent use of communication channels. The primary thing we must overcome here is that neither side can understand the other if both remain entrenched in their own ideals of communication. So, how do we accomplish that? In short, we communicate about communication, and we do it a lot. Here are a couple ideas for each side to keep in mind. For the person with ASD, know that small adjustments to phrasing can alter how questions or constructive criticism is perceived. And communicate how you'd like to be communicated with, or give people a sort of communication user manual, if you will. For the neurotypical, give the person with ASD the benefit of the doubt. Know that it's far more likely that they're operating in good faith than that they're trying to be rude or mean in any way. And have clear, consistent rules for use of communication channels and apply those with the same clarity and consistency. And both sides need to be open to giving and receiving feedback, which should be timely, kind, and include specific examples and clearly defined action items. And consistently communicate about communication. When it comes to productivity, the neurotypical expectations include having an even work effort and steady output, and that one easily accomplishes this during standard work hours. So, you know how some people are early birds and they're really productive in the morning, while others are night owls and maybe more productive in the evenings? Those are just two well-known examples of what we call chronotypes, and neurodivergent people are more likely to exhibit non-standard chronotypes. For neurotypicals who are night owls, you might already be familiar with how hard it is to get up in the morning before your body and brain are ready to be turned on. And the standard workplace schedule of 8 to 5 probably doesn't feel super friendly to you. And that's because it's not. The standard workplace was designed for early birds. And while these two categories of feathered friends might work best at different times of day, but usually follow a relatively predictable pattern of productivity, a person with ASD might not be so predictable. They might work in spurts throughout the day, or they might get done in a day what it would take a neurotypical a week to accomplish, but then they might struggle to get much of anything done the rest of the week. And this kind of lumpy energy and productivity is not uncommon, which can make standard work hours difficult to manage. This is probably one of the most difficult areas to navigate, so we're going to talk about this one backwards. Both sides need to keep business needs at the forefront of what you're talking about. Leadership needs to think critically about business needs. What are the official mission, vision, and values of the company? Do those actually require every employee to sit in a cubicle, clacking away at a keyboard, creating steady output from 8 to 5? Or does it mean meeting deadlines with quality production, being available during key meetings, and having enough overlapping work hours to make that possible? Considering that many teams already work in separate offices across multiple time zones, the concept of finding overlapping time for collaboration is already in practice, but you would be surprised how often that's disregarded when discussing accommodations that might include flexible work hours. For those with ASD, determine what tools or accommodations might be available to help smooth production during a standard workday as much as possible. This might include figuring out if maybe using something like the Pomodoro technique is useful to you, if remote work helps, or if working next to someone, also called body doubling, is what's helpful. A person with ASD may still need a flexible arrangement since that can help even out some of that lumpiness, but the typical business goal is to have hours as standard as possible. So it's the autistic person's responsibility to know themselves well enough and be willing to try something new, if reasonable, to determine what accommodations might suit best. The neurotypical expectation of participation is often very rigid. As I've mentioned, they expect external processing. And when it comes to processing, they also expect you to do this at an average speed, not too slow, not too fast, whatever that means. And somehow sitting still and giving eye contact is considered part of participation. The ASD reality is that processing could be internal, external, or a combination of both. Processing time could be faster or slower than what's deemed acceptable, and sometimes significantly so. And they may engage in rude behavior in order to focus. For example, they might not look at a person during a presentation or a conversation, or they might stim, which is some form of repetitive movement that helps a person self-regulate. To set reasonable expectations, the person with ASD needs to acknowledge that the way they process and participate might not be what's expected. And if they have a stim, know that some people might perceive it as distracting or rude. So you might need to think about if you have a suitable substitute, at least in certain situations. For neurotypicals, set clear expectations ahead of time if there's something specific you're looking for, and think critically about whether it's truly a requirement, a preference, or the way we've always done it. For example, are in-person meetings really necessary, or is virtual attendance acceptable? If you require everyone to speak during a meeting, is that really going to get you what you want, or is that just going to add extra noise and time that would be better spent doing the thing rather than talking about doing the thing? And also understand that some people with ASD might stim, avoid eye contact, etc., and requiring them to change their behavior can negatively impact their ability to process and retain information. Both parties need to understand the goal. What is the goal of requiring a specific form of participation? If we're playing soccer, or should I say real football, and one player decides they're going to do cartwheels and not pay attention to what's happening in the game, that would be a problem. But if, for example, the goalie likes to do jumping jacks while they're watching what's happening on the other end of the field, is that really a problem? As long as the goals are being scored and no one is engaging in yellow or red card behavior, it doesn't matter what quirks each player has. And this applies to the office too, but with a lot more sitting and typing and a lot less sweating. Most importantly, communicate. Communicate about what's working, what isn't, what adjustments can be made that might improve the outcome. Just talk about it. And know that there is no perfect, but if you decide to meet in the fuzzy zone and embrace the wiggles, you can unlock your superpowers and do great things together. Next up are some resources. A couple of these here I have noted as being very specific to the US, but from what I've noticed, there are a lot of basics that are similar across countries. So it can still at least be a good resource to get started. The most important resource on this page, though, is your employees and coworkers. Ask them what they need to be successful. If you do this with every single person, that will go a long way to creating a safe environment for people to actually talk about what they need, which means that you end up with happier, more productive employees, which seems like a good thing to me. There are more. Next up is the Q&A, but before I get to that, I just want to point out there's the QR code that will take you to my LinkedIn. If you prefer not QR codes, I have the link to my LinkedIn. And if for some reason you want access to the slides, just tell me and I can get them to you. And also, thank you. Thank you to New Stars for having me, to my mentor, Deborah, to Andy, and to James for helping, all of you guys for helping me organize my thoughts, learn about how to create a presentation, for the time that you took. And thank you to my audience. Okay, questions?